Greetings, Dr. Mark Winton here from the Department of Criminal Justice at the University of Central Florida in Orlando, Florida. And in this video, I'd like to talk about cyber-related homicides. I will rely a lot on the article that is in the journal Homicide Studies. I've always found just amazing work in this journal, just a wealth of information. Anyway, this is an article by Gerard Khachiatrian and Browning, published in 2020, titled Exploration of Crime Scene Characteristics in Cyber-Related Homicides, as I mentioned in the journal Homicide Studies, volume 24, pages 45 to 48. And I will go ahead and I will put that reference into the comment section. Okay, one of the things that I keep thinking about for a while now is how do people engaged in criminal activities use the internet, not just for exclusively a cyber crime where someone, sends someone a virus or someone, breaks into someone's account and takes funds, things of that nature. But I was thinking about how the cyber world can be used as a facilitator for crimes against a person. And in this case, we're looking at homicides. So this is a fascinating study, one of the first of its type, and I'm sure there'll be more to come. I'm already looking at this thinking, getting ideas, wow, for research related to this study. So really a big thank you for the authors of being innovative and doing such a wonderful study to move us along in this field. And so they point out, what do we know about violence facilitated by online interactions? And looking at the research, not a whole lot. We don't know a whole lot. I remember the first time I worked on a cybercrime, it was actually in the 80s. The sad thing is that's history now. I've been working in the field some 40 years now, studying crime and still learning a lot, because 40 years ago, 30 years ago, we wouldn't be having this discussion. But I remember the first time I helped some detectives on a case, it was helping them understand the meaning of terms on bulletin boards that we pulled up using a Hayes 1200 baud modem that plugged into the telephone line. And if anyone else lifted up the telephone in another office or another room, it broke the connection. You had to start from scratch. And I think we used a service called CompuServe at the time. So any of you that are historians of computer technology, there you go. 1200 Hayes baud modem. Okay, it was a big thing too, about the size of it was heavier than your, iPad. That's just a modem. So interesting to think about. And we were able to trace a group that was engaging in criminal behavior, and were posting and communicating on a bulletin board with each other. And the detectives were able to understand what they were communicating. And my sociological background assisted in understanding what was going on, and then they were able to pursue that case. One thing I remember about that case was, when I was talking to the detectives, they're kind of looking at me like, okay, Mr. Academic, okay, and I said, but I got something really useful for you here, a telephone number. And I gave them all the documents because I printed that out on the dot matrix printer and highlighted. I said, this is the number to call. And they're like, thank you, see you. And they went to work. But so much has changed, and it just keeps changing, getting more complex. And so if you have been a student of the history of technology and computers, you can see all that, and thinking about social media. I mean, it's hard to, I guess if I was raised and socialized as a young kid with social media, I might have very different views of it now. And where there wasn't a time where you didn't have cell phones and social media, things of that nature. It just, it just seems like, yeah, that's just the reality now. Even online courses. I mean, I didn't start teaching online courses. Nope, not at all. So one of the things that I wanted to mention is that I think it's important to look at the history, see where we've been, so we can try to project where we're going. And even though there's a lot of uncertainty, we really need to do that. So the authors defined cyber-related homicides, and to quote them from page 46, a homicide event that occurs during the first face-to-face meeting between two or more people who became acquainted online, end of quote. And so I think that's really important to look at the first face-to-face meeting that they have, and they became known to each other through online interaction. And we interact with people and organizations online constantly now, and maybe don't even think twice about it unless there's something out of the norm of interaction where it's like, whoa, something strange there, or something to be aware of. We have some case studies of various online facilitated crimes that we can look at in other research, but this is really the first type that focused on homicide. So Girard et al. Looked at homicide cases of people who had never met face-to-face until the homicide event. In other words, they were strangers. They knew each other, or thought they knew each other through online interaction. Some of the research questions they have: what strategies are used to lure victims? What do the crime scenes look like? And are there subtypes of homicide offenders? They had a sample of 61 cases that they discovered between 2000 and 2017, and they found there's a increase during 2011 and 2017, which makes sense based on how much more social media was becoming prominently used. They sampled from several countries, and 8 cases had more than one offender, and 7 cases included serial killers. Okay, right there, I thought, wow, they have 7 cases that included serial killers. As a qualitative researcher, I'm thinking, okay, those are 7 cases I'd like to study more intensely. Moving from their research into a related domain to look at, cyber facilitated homicides by serial killers. I'm guessing that probably hasn't been done, or there's very little research done in that area. So if you're interested in that area, you're going to do research in the future, that might be an area to pursue if that's your interest. The data collection, their methods. The data collection. Data was collected through electronic databases, including cases, media reports, and research articles. So a lot of open source materials there. Identification of the case led to further online searching. So they were able to, get multiple narratives of what had occurred, multiple articles and reports and things of that nature. So the online environments where the perpetrator and victim became familiar included social media sites, dating sites, messaging, and gaming sites. So there's when we talk about the cyber facilitated crimes, there's different actual sites we can begin to look at and how those crimes are committed. And the data coding and analysis, they constructed a coding dictionary, and they coded behaviors as being present, not present, or no information, or it was unclear. So again, 61 cases, 70 offenders, 68 victims, 70% of the cases were in or after 2010. Okay, let's look at the results. They used, I believe, smallest space analysis. They used a strategy to see if there's different typologies, basically characteristics of the offenders based on what we know from the offenders and the crime scenes. And they were able to come up with some different categories. That gives us some insight into different types of criminal behaviors and maybe even thought processes of these criminals. So there were 62, when looking at the offender characteristics, there were 62 males and 8 females, and the age range was 16 to 55 with an average of 27.5 years of age. 42 were from the United States. Looking at previous convictions, 20% had been convicted of violent crime, 17% theft or robbery, and 14.3% sex offenses. So we do see a criminal history in the background of some of these offenders, but certainly not all, when you start looking at those numbers. The victim characteristics, 53% were female, 47% were male. The age range of the victims was 12 to 69, with the median or the middle point 31. If we look at the luring strategies, the victim, on page 55, they define the luring strategies. Victim was persuaded to meet with the offender under false pretenses. So that's from page 55. Victim was persuaded to meet with the offender under false pretenses. So this gives us just some clues on what to look at in the different strategies. So let's just briefly look at those numbers. In no luring, it's 46% of the cases, for example, a date that went wrong. 15% of the cases were the promise of an intimate encounter. 15% were fake identity. 13% were the promise of providing job, product, or service. And 7% were the promise of paying for a product or service. 2% were the promise of providing help, and 2% couldn't be classified. So you see almost half, no luring. It was something, went wrong in the interaction. But you can also see that there were, some that were sexually related, and then there were others that were related to providing products or exchanging items or things of that nature. This reminds me of a case I'm familiar with that happened close by where I live, and that is someone called or contacted a person to have their computer repaired, and the person came over in the evening to repair the computer, and when the resident opened the door, a man and a woman jumped into the house and beat him up and robbed him. And so that, did not result in a homicide. Fortunately, the victim was not seriously injured, but that certainly is a violent crime. In that case, he was paying to get a service, computer fixed, and the perpetrators were two individuals, a man and a woman, who posed as the computer repair person, and when he opened the door, they jumped him. The interesting thing about this case is that's the case that I read from public information, but people questioned, was it really, was he really just trying to get his computer fixed, or was something else going? And I'm thinking, you know what? He's a crime victim, and he was assaulted, and that's what we need to focus on. And how do we prevent that from happening? How do we understand that? Okay, let's look at the results. Based on crime scene characteristics, the researchers found four major themes for cyber-related homicides, and we're going to look at what those different themes consist of. And the four are excessive violence, fatal escalation, that's non-premeditated, crime-related, for example, committing another felony, and predatory behavior. So let's look at how we can characterize these particular crimes. So let's take a look at the crime scene characteristics and the themes. So looking at excessive violence, that would tend to be an expressive related crime. What the researchers found in the cases of expressive violence were multiple wounds, the use of a sharp weapon, injuries to the torso, and also mutilation. And so those were classified into the, or those tended to fall into the excessive violence type. In contrast, the crime-related or instrumental type is where the offender brought a weapon, contacted the person through Craigslist, used a gun, and there's more likely to be multiple offenders in the crime-related one. So they're committing, another felony, robbery, something of that sort. And then in the fatal escalation, which would be considered expressive-related crime, the perpetrator killed inside a residential setting. They arranged for a romantic date. There's a female victim. The body was moved from the kill site. The murder took place at night. The victim was strangled. There's concealment of forensic evidence. The victim was found naked. The victim was buried. That's the fatal escalation expressive type, which again, I mentioned earlier, tended to be non-premeditated in that regard. And then the predatory behavior, which tends to be more an instrumental related type. The body's found in an isolated area. The offender lies about their identity in the online interactions. There's sexual assault. The victim and offender seeking a homosexual relationship, and the offender is also a serial killer. That was in 19% of the cases. The predatory behavior would be the one that we'd want to take a closer look at if we were looking at serial killers. And so that really gives us some ideas that there's some different characteristics of these cyber-facilitated homicides that are really important to think about. And so that leads us to, the big question of applications for safety, for prevention. And so there's a few things we can gather from this. And of course, it would be important to have all kinds of presentations in public forums, in religious institutions, in schools, in the media, on how to protect yourself, how people can protect themselves from all these cyber-related crimes. And I know our local stations do a pretty good job of presenting some cases, and then they'll talk about how to prevent. And there's also a lot of interest in organizations that have presentations out and so forth. But looking at applications for safety, some recommendations to meet a stranger in an outdoor setting during the day with other people present. And so this would be avoiding meeting at a residence or a hotel, or meeting in an area where there's not many people, and meeting during the day where there's lots of people. That is important to think about. Also, being aware of drug and alcohol use in interaction, and also taking a look at other risk reduction strategies from other research studies involving online communications and things of that nature. In looking at further research, the authors provide some suggestions. For example, getting larger samples, and also looking at how law enforcement can use this data, and then analyzing chat log transcripts. That is really a wealth of information if you have chat log transcripts. I remember when I was writing, co-authoring a book, and the psychologist and I were looking at some chat log transcripts of some crimes, and seeing how that developed over time online, leading in this case to sex-related crimes, not homicides, but sex crimes. And then also creating risk assessment tools, being able to judge the levels of risk. And then prevention and also intervention, things that can help out. A lot of police departments help out their communities by providing this information. I know my local police department And the neighboring local police department both have done recently community presentations on cyber crimes, not homicide crimes, but just protecting, mostly financial. But there's a lot of insight in the methods of how to protect oneself, and so I think that police departments do us a great service by providing these educational seminars to the communities. So I will go ahead and wrap up. The only thing I would say here is it's going to get more complex, and we just got to keep on studying this. We have to try to catch up. We have to try to project what do we need to look at in the future, and do this type of research and support it. So this wraps up this video. Thank you.